Story 1 by Mark Smith. It was just another night for me. I've been driving a taxi in San Francisco for years. But that night, something was off. The city was wrapped up in this thick fog, like a blanket, the kind you can hardly see through. I remember thinking it was kinda spooky. But hey, I had a job to do. I was just about to call it a night when this fare popped up on my phone. It was a good one. Across the city, ending near the Golden Gate Bridge. The money was too good to pass up, even with the fog and all. So, I took it. I picked up my last coffee of the night and headed out. Driving through that fog felt eerie. The streets I knew like the back of my hand were all hidden behind this misty curtain, and the usual city noises were muffled, almost like they were underwater. I felt this chill down my spine, not from the cold, but from the weirdness of it all. My GPS started acting up too, flickering on and off, which never happens. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the road, but man, it was tough. Every turn I made, the fog seemed to get thicker, like it was closing in on me. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, trying to convince myself that it was just fog, nothing more. But deep down, something felt really, really wrong. As I got closer to the bridge, that's when things really started getting weird. I started hearing these whispers. At first, I thought it was simply the radio acting up, or maybe I was just too tired. But then I realized the radio was off. The whispers were soft, kind of like someone was talking right outside the window, but every time I looked, there was no one there. The whispers weren't making any sense, just bits and pieces of sentences, but they kept saying something about turning off, taking a detour. It was freaky. I tried to ignore them, keep my eyes on the road, but they got louder. It was like the fog had a voice, and it didn't want to be ignored. Every time I passed a sign that pointed to the Golden Gate Bridge, the whispers got angrier, more incessant. They wanted me to go there, but I knew better. Or, at least, I thought I did. I kept driving my usual route, but the GPS glitched again, and suddenly, it was directing me towards the bridge too. My hands were sweating. My heart was pounding in my chest like it wanted to break out. I felt trapped. You know? Like, no matter what I did, everything was pushing me towards that goal. It was the kind of scare where you can't even scream because your throat's all tight. I kept telling myself it was just a foggy night, just a weird night. But man, I've never felt anything like that before. So there I was, just about to hit the approach to the Golden Gate Bridge, and the whispers were now yelling, almost screaming at me to turn off. My mind was racing, my heart thumping loud in my ears, and that's when I saw it, shapes moving in the fog. Not clear enough to make out what they were, just shadows, but they were definitely there, darting around like they were circling me. I started to panic, big time. The whispers, the shadows, the fog. It all felt like it was closing in on me. And that's when I decided, no way, I'm not doing this. I'm not driving off that bridge. I gripped the steering wheel hard, and I did the only thing that felt right. I turned the wheel sharply away from the bridge, trying to head back into the city. But just as I turned, my car's electronics went haywire. The dashboard lights flickered. The engine stuttered. And for a second, it felt like the car was going to die right there. Then, out of nowhere, this huge shadow loomed right in front of the car. I swerved, hard, to avoid hitting whatever it was. I still don't know if it was real, or just the fog playing tricks on me. My car smashed into the safety barriers with a loud crash. The airbag popped open and hit me in the face. It hurt, but not as much as my head did when it slammed against the window. For a minute, everything was just ringing and blurry. I sat there, dazed, trying to figure out if I was alive or dead. The whispers had stopped. The shadows were gone. And it was just me, breathing hard in the wreck of my car, the fog slowly swirling around me. I never felt so alone and scared in my life. I knew I had to get out of there, away from the bridge, away from the fog. It took everything I had to unbuckle, crawl out of the smashed door, and start limping back towards the city lights, leaving the bridge and that nightmarish fog behind me. Limping away from the wreck, each step was a mix of pain and relief. My head throbbed, and my body ached all over from the crash and the airbag impact. The fog seemed to retreat as I moved farther from the bridge, like it was tied to that place, or those whispers. The night was still thick around me, but the city lights were getting brighter as I made my way back. It felt like walking from a nightmare back into reality. I remember looking back over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting the fog to roll back in, or those whispers to start up again, but there was nothing to see, just the quiet of the night and the distant sound of the city. When I finally got to a more populated area, I found a late-night diner still open. I stumbled in, and the few people there just stared at me, probably because I looked like a mess. I didn't care. I was just so glad to see other people, to hear the normal sounds of dishes clanking and people talking. Likewise, I sat in that diner until the sun came up, nursing a coffee, trying to make sense of what had happened. The waitress kept asking if I was okay, if I needed a doctor, but I just told her I needed to rest. The truth was, I didn't know how to explain it, didn't think anyone would believe me. It was too bizarre, too frightening. As the sun rose and the fog completely cleared, I felt this heavy weight lift off my chest. I was alive, bruised and shaken, but alive. I decided right then and there, no more night shifts for me. Whatever was out there on the bridge, it wasn't worth finding out. That night changed me. It made me realize some things are better left alone. Some places better left unvisited. I've stuck to daytime driving since then, and whenever I see the fog rolling in, I feel that old fear creep up, but I just turn my back on it and walk away. No job, no amount of money is worth facing that again.
Story 2 by Jack Wilson. So, you want to hear about that crazy night, huh? All right, let's start from the beginning. My name's Jack, and I've been driving folks around Wichita for a few years now. Ever since the divorce, I started driving more often, especially at night. It keeps my mind off things, you know. That night, it was raining like crazy, and the streets were almost empty. I logged into my rideshare app, hoping to make a few extra bucks because of the bad weather. I remember feeling a bit lonely, just me and my old car, but I kinda liked the quiet. It gave me time to think. Anyway, I got a ride request from someone named Mara. Her profile was new. No picture, no ratings, nothing. Normally I might have hesitated, but the fare was good, so I thought, why not? I drove over to pick her up at this old apartment complex on the edge of town. The place had seen better days, and there weren't many lights. Kinda eerie, you know? When Mara got in the car, she was all bundled up in this big coat and scarf, even though it wasn't that cold. She didn't say much, just gave a quick hello and kept her eyes on her phone. I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't listen. She just asked me to drive and gave me these specific directions, avoiding the main roads. As we drove, I started feeling this, I don't know, this weird vibe. Mara kept looking over her shoulder like she was scared or something. Made me feel uneasy, like maybe I picked up someone I shouldn't have. But there I was, just driving through the rain, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. Mara didn't want to take the main roads, so we were driving down these dark streets. She kept directing me, turn here, go left there, kind of bossy but scared at the same time. I noticed her clutching that little suitcase on her lap really tight. Her knuckles were all white. At one point, she finally put her phone down and looked straight ahead, serious-like. Then, out of nowhere, she told me, "Drive faster, please." Her voice was shaky. I asked her if everything was all right, just trying to make sure there wasn't something wrong. She glanced back again and said, "Just keep driving." That's when it really hit me that something weird was going on. It wasn't just about avoiding traffic anymore. It felt like we were running from something, or someone. The more we drove, the more nervous I got. I mean, here I was, in the middle of the night, with a passenger who acted like we were in some kind of danger. I started thinking about all those stories you hear, drivers getting into bad situations. Likewise, I have to admit, I was scared, terrified, but I tried to keep it cool, just focusing on the road, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the windshield. So, we kept driving, right? And the longer we drove, the stranger things got. Mara was all quiet for a while, just staring out the window like she was lost in her own world. Then she'd start mumbling to herself, really low, so I couldn't catch everything she said. But what I did hear, it didn't make any sense. Stuff about being followed and needing to hide. It was creepy. We drove through parts of town I barely knew existed. Narrow lanes, old buildings that looked like no one had lived there for years. Sometimes, Mara would tell me to stop, and she'd peer out into the darkness like she was looking for someone or something. Then she'd just shake her head and we'd keep going. At one point, we passed this old playground. The swings were just moving in the wind, and she freaked out. She asked me to drive faster, her voice all panicky. I floored it, not really knowing why, just reacting to her fear. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely hear the rain anymore. It was around then that I heard this weird noise coming from her suitcase. It was like a muffled thumping. I asked her what was in the suitcase. She just glared at me and pulled it closer, warned me to mind my own business and keep my eyes on the road. Man, that made me even more nervous. What had I gotten myself into? The whole situation felt wrong. I was just a driver, I wasn't cut out for this kind of drama. But there I was, caught up in it, with no idea how to get out. All I knew was I had to keep driving, keep following her directions, even though every instinct was telling me I should stop the car and get out of there. But I didn't. I just kept driving. Things hit a peak when Mara suddenly shouted for me to stop the car. We were way out in the middle of nowhere, some old industrial area that looked completely abandoned. It was pitch black, except for the headlights of my car. My heart was racing, and I was sweating despite the cool night air. Mara was breathing heavy, and she looked around all wild-eyed before she turned to me and said, "They're here." I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. It was just us and the sound of the rain. That's when she confessed. She told me her ex-wife was after us, that she was dangerous and wouldn't stop until she found her. My mind was spinning. This was way more than I signed up for. Despite my fear, I felt this urge to help her. I didn't know if what she was saying was true, but she was terrified. So, I decided to help her escape. We started this crazy chase through the streets, turning this way and that, trying to lose someone who might have been following us. I pushed my old car as fast as it could go, taking sharp turns and even going off-road at one point. Then, I saw headlights behind us. They appeared suddenly, and every time I turned, they turned. Mara was freaking out, screaming to keep going, to not let them catch us. The pressure was intense. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and all I could think about was how I needed to get out of this nightmare. Finally, we lost the lights, or maybe they gave up, I don't know. Mara directed me to this old warehouse. She said it was safe there, that we could hide. I was doubtful, but what choice did I have? I was in too deep. We pulled into the dark building, and everything went silent except for our heavy breathing. That's when the real horror started. Once we were inside the warehouse, Mara finally let go of her suitcase and started pacing back and forth, muttering to herself. The place was creepy, filled with shadows and the sound of dripping water echoing around us. I tried to calm her down, asking what we should do next, but she was way past listening. Suddenly, she stopped pacing and looked at me with this intense, wild look in her eyes. She said, "You don't get it, Jack. There's no one after us. It's all in my head." My stomach dropped. All that fear, the chase, it was because of her delusions. She started crying, saying how sorry she was, how her mind tricks her into believing her ex-wife was still haunting her. I didn't know what to do. I was relieved. There was no real danger, but scared because of the situation I was in. The real danger was the person standing in front of me, lost in her own mind. Mara then revealed her plan. She believed the only way out of her torment was to end everything, for both of us. She thought by bringing me here, away from everyone, it would be easier to, end it. I was terrified, realizing that I had to get out of there. She was unstable, and I couldn't help her, not like this. When she briefly turned away, looking for something in her suitcase, I saw my chance. I quietly backed towards the door, my heart pounding so loud I was sure she could hear it. As I reached the door, Mara turned and saw me trying to escape. She screamed for me to come back, that we were supposed to do this together. I didn't look back. I just ran out of the warehouse, into the cold, rainy night, running faster than I ever had in my life. Furthermore, I didn't stop until I reached my car, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. After I drove away from that warehouse, I didn't stop until I felt safe, far away from Mara and her dark delusions. My hands were still shaking, and my heart hadn't calmed down. It felt like I had just escaped from a real-life nightmare. I called the cops as soon as I got a good distance away. I told them everything about Mara, the chase, her mental state, and the warehouse. I hoped they could help her, maybe get her the help she desperately needed. I went straight to the hospital after that because, man, I was not okay. My head was spinning, and my whole body was shaking. The doctors checked me over, said it was mostly the shock and a bit of dehydration. But mentally, I was a wreck. It took me a long time to feel normal again, to not jump at every shadow or flinch at every unexpected sound. That night changed how I saw many things. It made me realize how thin the line is between reality and what some folks' minds convince them is real. It was terrifying to see someone so lost in their own fears that they couldn't see the world as it really was. Made me think about how important it is to have someone to talk to keep your mind grounded. I went back to driving after a while, but I was a lot more cautious, picked my passengers more carefully, avoided the night shifts for some time. I guess I was just trying to find some normalcy again, trying to forget the fear and the panic of that night. But you don't forget something like that. Not really. It sticks with you, teaches you, warns you. So, yeah, that's my story. A ride that went from just another night to a terrifying escape from something I never saw coming. It's one of those things you hope never happens again, but it's also something that makes you stronger, more aware. And I guess in some weird way, I'm thankful for that.
Story 3 by Lucas Mondes. Alright, so let me tell you about this one night that honestly, I can't seem to shake off. It was a typical Utah night, chilly with a bit of wind, just dark enough to make you appreciate any light. I was out driving during my usual Uber gig. My name's Lucas, by the way, and I just moved to Utah not too long ago. Trying to start fresh, Anyway, I had this app running, looking for my next fare, hoping to make enough to keep the lights on at home. I like driving at night. Less traffic, and the quiet helped me think. So I get this ping from an address way out on the edge of town. It was far, but the fare showed up high, and I needed that money, so I didn't think twice. I drove out there, and man, it was creepy. Like one of those old houses you see in horror movies, all dark and looking like no one had lived there for ages. I pulled up, waiting for my passenger. I checked the time, and it was getting late. Likewise, I waited and waited, but nobody showed up. I was about to cancel the ride and head back when I heard it, the sound of the seatbelt in the back seat clicking. I froze for a second, then turned around quick, but there was nobody there. Not only that, but I remember my heart started racing, and I felt this cold rush of air pass through the car. I told myself, Lucas, it's just your imagination, man, trying to brush it off. But deep down, I felt something wasn't right. I mean, you hear stories, but you never think something like that will happen to you, right? So there I was, sitting in my car, trying to convince myself I hadn't just heard what I thought I did. But then it got weirder. The car's GPS started acting up, rerouting itself over and over. And that's when I heard it, a whisper, right from the back seat. It was so faint, like someone was trying to give me directions or something, but no one was there. My hands were shaking a bit, and I could feel this heavy, cold feeling, like someone was sitting right behind me. I didn't want to, but I looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the empty back seat. But then I swear the seat looked like someone was sitting on it, like it was pressed down. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things because of the late hour. I told myself I needed to get out of there, so I started the car and began to drive away from that creepy house. But the whole drive felt off. The air in the car felt colder than usual, and sometimes I'd hear that whisper again, telling me to turn back or take a different street. I didn't want to listen, but it was like the car was moving on its own, following the whispered directions. I tried to focus, keep my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. Fear was creeping up my spine, making me wish I'd never taken that ride. As I kept driving, following those whispered directions without even realizing it, things started getting even more intense. The whispers turned into clear words, and they weren't friendly anymore. They were commanding, forceful, like they were angry I hadn't listened earlier. The temperature in the car dropped so much I could see my breath. It was like driving in a freezer, and I kept fiddling with the heater, but it made no difference. Then, out of nowhere, the steering wheel jerked hard under my hands, pulling the car towards an old dirt road. I fought it, trying to keep the car on the main road, but it was like wrestling with a ghost. The car seemed to have a mind of its own, speeding up, the headlights flickering, making the trees on either side look like they were closing in on me. I was scared out of my mind, heart pounding so loud I could hear it over the engine. I shouted, "Who are you? What do you want?" But there was no answer. Just more chilling air, and those forceful, angry whispers. It felt personal, like whatever was with me in the car had a reason to be angry, and it was all directed at me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to a screeching halt in the middle of that dirt road. Everything went silent for a moment, like the world was holding its breath. Then, a voice, clear as day, came from the back seat. It told me a story about a hit and run that happened right on this road, years ago. The victim, never found, never missed. That's when it hit me. The spirit in my car was that victim, still lost, still angry, looking for some kind of justice, or maybe just recognition. Sitting there on that dark road, hearing the story from what seemed like thin air, I felt a mix of terror and sadness. This spirit, whoever they were, had been left alone and forgotten. The voice grew softer, more desperate. It was haunting, knowing this person had been left unseen, unheard. I didn't know what to do. I mean, how do you help a ghost? But I knew I couldn't just drive away and forget. So I spoke into the empty air, saying, "I hear you. I know you're here. And I'm sorry this happened to you." I don't know if that's what they needed to hear, but the atmosphere in the car changed. It wasn't as cold, and the pressing weight of their presence eased up a bit. Deciding I had to do something more, I promised aloud, "I'll tell your story. I'll let people know what happened here." It felt right, like making that promise was giving them some peace. Then, just as quickly as it all started, the feeling of someone else in the car disappeared. The seatbelt clicked again like someone was unbuckling it, and then, silence. The cold was gone, the whispers stopped, and even the air felt lighter. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I turned the car around and drove back towards town. The GPS worked fine now, like nothing had ever been wrong. I drove slower than usual, still shaken, glancing occasionally at the back seat in the mirror, half expecting to see something. But it was just me, alone in the car, with a story that I knew I needed to share. Not just because I promised, but because it felt important to acknowledge someone who had been forgotten. By the time I got back to town, the first light of dawn was breaking, casting a soft glow over everything. It felt surreal driving back into the normal world after what I'd experienced. I parked my car outside my small apartment, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a while, trying to process everything. I knew that things couldn't just go back to normal. That night changed something in me. I decided right then and there that I was done driving for Uber. No more late nights alone on the road. I couldn't risk going through something like that again. The fear was too real, the threat too close. Later that day, after some rest and a lot of coffee, I started looking into the story the spirit had told me. I checked old newspapers online, talked to a few locals, and pieced together the story of a young man who had disappeared years ago. It was a cold case, hardly remembered by the town's people. Feeling a sense of responsibility, I wrote down everything I remembered from that night. Every detail the voice had shared. Every feeling I'd felt. I published it online, hoping it might bring some attention to the story, maybe even some closure to any family the young man had left behind. As the days passed, the story spread, and people started to take notice. Some expressed skepticism, others shared similar experiences, and slowly, the forgotten story of the hit and run started to re-emerge in local discussions. It felt good to keep my promise, to give that lost soul some recognition. But even now, when I drive past that old road or a lonely stretch at night, I can't help but feel a chill, remembering the unseen passenger in Utah. I always check my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that seatbelt click again. And sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever really be alone in my car again.